The Constitution of the United States, was it a pro-slavery document? Now, at its inception, this was a declaration. This was not even really a conversation that was had in the public sphere. You initially had a very small group of abolitionists that were unhappy with the Constitution. But they were a very small share of even the larger anti-slavery sentiment at the time, and a very good argument can be made that the principles and the programs and logical follow-through of gradual emancipation versus the using the federal government to enact a national abolition was very much the preferable program to pursue. And that's exactly what the founders thought, and the framers, and a vast majority of anti-slavery advocates at the time. Very few were pushing for federally mandated, forced, and required abolition across the entire nation, such as it was at this time. However, failures of the Articles of Confederation kind of necessitated a revisiting of the kind of national government, its roles, functions versus the states, authorities, and the like, which is interesting and very insightful already. There's kind of this weird mysticism surrounding what should have been presumably the consequences of, say, the Declaration and the Constitution, when in fact these things were not intended to just magically transform the landscape, but were meant to put the systems into place for these things to happen. Much like the Declaration, when it was signed, didn't just erase thousands of years of human tradition, history, and ingrained culture, and all of a sudden every Southern slaveholding Democrat felt themselves equal to blacks. The Constitution was much the same way. This was acknowledged at the time regularly. In more contemporary times, it's kind of been buried by historical revisionists, where instead they'll point to this kind of lack of fulfilling this juvenile fantasy of just instant transformation as evidence that the Constitution was not a good document or an anti-slavery document, and that it really wasn't that great, and it should be ultimately be rejected, replaced, upgraded, or what have you, which is also not a new conversation. That began with the rise, really, of the Democratic Party and its desire to force federal protections on slavery and for slavery and to expand slavery. So hold that little detail in mind. To quote Dr. Harry Jaffa, when he describes the founding more generally, but referring to the Declaration and Constitution, he explains, and I quote, "Yet how to convert these principles into political institutions, even for themselves, was hardly a settled matter, and how to extend them to all those to whom they were rightfully bound to extend them represented still another challenge." And what Dr. Jaffa is explaining here is just quite simply what I did in the introduction. These documents outlined a series of governing philosophies, what they viewed to be timeless truths, but just acknowledgement of those truths was not the same as creating an entire system of government over one of the largest land masses in the world and having that function well. And you can see the initial failure in that with the Articles of Confederation. So this really just kind of highlights that whole concept, this kind of American experimentation. And the Constitution was very clearly an improvement on the Articles in virtually every way. But speaking specifically just to the Constitution as it applies on the subject of slavery, and you can really take these same arguments and details and extend them into issues of sex and creed and virtually all the little check boxes and that we tend to use to organize people all the different methods and machinations of identity politics, because the Constitution rejected and denied any attempts made at the time, really, to view people as anything other than Americans. So when you get into the Constitutional Convention, there's a very similar circumstance that which existed with the Declaration, and that you had competing interests, north-south, anti-slavery, pro-slavery. Those states that would later become kind of the hotbed of the Democratic Party were, of course, adamantly pro-slavery. During the kind of the onset of the convention, of which we can thank James Madison for his notes. Otherwise, we might not even know these conversations. But then the delegates from South Carolina and others, but generally we're speaking of South Carolina. We have John Rutledge and Charles Pinckney. And upon entering into conversations about how to form the federal government and what its powers would be, they declared that if there was any meddling with the importation of Negroes, that's a direct quote from Charles Pinckney, that they would never agree to any kind of federal government that had that power. Now, other slave states joined in. You had Hugh Williamson from North Carolina, and he spoke more on behalf of the entire southern states. Really, he said, if the intent here is to, create a government that can control and restrict, and of course, the fear being eventually eliminate slavery, then there's just no way that the southern states are going to be on board. So that's the environment going into the Constitutional Convention. So really, that left two options, right? There could be concessions made, compromises made, and I would argue some of the most brilliant acts of statescraft ever made that would ensure the passage of a constitution, and that constitution would then, as it was designed and framed, would allow for the ultimate extinction of slavery. Or the second option is they could grandstand, they could shout, take a position of moral superiority, demand that all the slave states abolish slavery, release their slaves, and in so doing, of course, destroy any hope of a constitution and any hope of a stronger union. But they would have made favorable headlines for both radical abolitionists at the time and for the kind of the armchair criticisms launched towards them from the modern day backwards in time, when critics decry the fact that abolition wasn't codified in the original Constitution. Now, there's really just three primary elements of the Constitution that are most contested when it comes to trying to understand, is this pro-slavery, was it anti-slavery? That's your kind of your slave clauses, as they're kind of generally referred to. You have the slave trade clause, you have the fugitive slave clause, and you have, of course, the infamous 3/5 compromise. Now, each one of those I'm going to address individually, just for ease and convenience for everyone else. Now, what's interesting about just kind of looking at the overall kind of mindset coming into the convention, we've already addressed that in southern states, from entering the door, were threatening, hey, if you go against our interests, we're just going to leave. We still have the Articles of Confederation. That's our agreed upon compact between the states. And under the Articles, you can do nothing to us as far as slavery goes. The southern states really didn't have much of or anything to benefit from a stronger kind of federal government system at this time. And also at this time, one of the kind of the estimate I go with is around 2/3 of the entire economy was from the South. Of course, those are raw numbers. That's not counting them selling things to the north that then had to be processed or what have you. But either way, they were a tremendously significant economic driver of the new nation. And of course, this is 1787. There are still hostilities with Britain. There's still the potential for Spanish invasion. There's several things going on where a newly formed fledgling country really needs to have that income, especially when it comes to the most basic of governmental purposes, which is defending its citizens, especially to outside invaders. Now, coming from the other side, the other perspective here, we can learn a little bit here about the anti-slavery part. So Colonel Mason, he kind of reiterated a lot of the annoyances that were described by others. He said, and I quote, "This infernal traffic originated in the avarice of British merchants. The British government constantly checked the attempts of Virginia to put a stop to it." Now this might remind you of the omitted passage of the Declaration of Independence, and for good reason. It was well established and understood, although not as well spoken in the modern day, that slavery only existed in the colonies at this time, and now at the States, because of British coercion. The British Empire had gained materially, very much so, from the trafficking of slaves. And of course, it was meant to destabilize the country, which they were very correct in that as well. Now, Oliver Ellsworth, he very famously noted, and I quote, "As population increases, poor laborers will be so plenty as to render slaves useless. Slavery, in time, will not be a speck in our country. Provision is already made in Connecticut for abolishing it, and the abolition has already taken place in Massachusetts." Now, Roger Sherman, he was another delegate, he shared that opinion. He said, and I quote, that the abolition of slavery seemed to be going on in the United States, and that the good sense of the several states would probably by degrees complete that. So what we're seeing here is that when we refer to the founding understanding of slavery as a necessary evil transplanted, but doomed to its ultimate extinction. And a lot of that doom, that death sentence of sorts, comes from the Constitution, which we'll learn as we explore these different so-called slave clauses and how they damaged slavery to a terrific and tremendous extent. But I mean, again, examining it as a whole, which I know, in kind of our historical hindsight and all the many advantages that brings, an informed person might wonder, well, how were they so wrong about the gradual decay of slavery? And for that conversation, we'll discuss Calhounism specifically as kind of reshaping the entire political landscape. But that's getting ahead of ourselves just a little bit. So let's examine kind of some broader perspectives on the Constitution before we get into the specific clauses. So, of course, Frederick Douglass, the most revered abolitionist of the 19th century, and a man who his numerous speeches and publications should be read by everyone, especially self-made men. He began life as a radical abolitionist who denounced the founders, the framers, the whole doctrine. And then through education, however, he came to radically transform these ideas. So his own kind of misconceptions on the founding were a result of ignorance. And once he, as men of intellectual honesty do, chose to kind of rectify that ignorance, he was obviously taken aback by the actual function of these things. And in one of his many defenses of the Constitution, he notes very accurately, and I quote, "Abolish slavery tomorrow, and not a sentence or syllable of the Constitution need be altered. It was purposely so framed as to give no claim, no sanction to the claim of property in man. If in its origin slavery had any relation to the government, It was only as the scaffolding to the magnificent structure, to be removed as soon as the building was completed. So what Douglas is highlighting here is an idea that's going to carry out through our examination of the slave trade clauses. That slavery was intentionally, both as an institution and even the very words, they were intentionally omitted from the Constitution for very great purpose and intent. Thomas Lloyd's, he was another very, very potent kind of anti-slavery, not so much activist, I would say, at this point in American history, but just a strong figure in opposition to slavery. And both he and James Iredell, they encountered, of course, people who were unhappy with the Constitution whenever they went back to their respective states and discussed it with, their citizens and also their state legislatures. And Thomas Lloyd's addresses this so well. He says, provision is made that Congress shall have power to prohibit the importation of slaves after the year 1808. But the gentlemen in opposition accuse this system of a crime because it has not prohibited them at once. Now, this next part is key. I suspect those gentlemen are not well acquainted with the business of the diplomatic body, or they would know that an agreement might be made that did not perfectly accord with the will and pleasure of any one person. Instead of finding fault with what has been gained, I am happy to see a disposition in the United States to do so much. So, he's very eloquently, as they apparently were as a species back then, he's very eloquently explaining, hey, you might not like this because it doesn't satisfy what you feel like the end goal should be, what it should have accomplished. But you only hold that position because you're not aware of the actual circumstances on the ground. And that it's truly a success that we accomplished as much as we did, which is a very accurate statement to make. Now, James Iredell, he also spoke on the Constitution. He had some kind of unhappy people back in his home state as well. Again, thinking, well, what are all these things? Why does slavery still exist? And he says very simply, he says, consider then what would be the difference between our present situation in this respect if we do not agree to the Constitution, and what it will be if we do agree to it. If we do not agree to it, do we remedy the evil? Of course, referring to slavery. No, sir, we do not. For if the Constitution be not adopted, it will be in the power of every state to continue it forever. They may or may not abolish it at their discretion. But if we adopt the Constitution, the trade must cease after 20 years, whether particular states please so or not. Surely then we gain by it. So kind of the views coming in at this time, and it is a bit of a point of irony too that I should mention, that even the delegates from the slave states thought that they won in this, and this was an intentional thing, and really just reflects on the brilliance of the kind of the founding era anti-slavery principled men at the convention, and how they were able to convince the slave states to concede so much, which we'll explore here shortly with the slave trade clauses. But what Thomas Lloyd especially and Iredell highlight here is that the things that are accomplished, the principles, the morals, and the governmental structure that they gain from the Constitution not only contributes to American exceptionalism in that it's the only constitution in the world at the time, and really since, that is structured and phrased in such a way that it acknowledges that authority originates in the citizens. And then we have our separate systems of governance through the different layers, and each one of those layers is meant to safeguard the protection of citizens and to enforce rights and all these fun things. But it was also the first constitution at the time that, as part of a founding document, restricted the slave trade. So the major tenets of these would be the the slave trade clauses. So we're going to address each one of those individually and really explore kind of the nuts and bolts of the arguments and the reasons and within for were these slave trade clauses so often maligned in the modern day? Were they actually pro-slavery devices?